Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Sue Thomas, president of City Club, and I welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel and those of you listening on OPB or KPBS radio or watching on cable television. Thank you for joining City Club today on Friday, October 30th for this week's Friday Forum. Our speakers today will address the state of Black Oregon. But first, some announcements. As always, a reminder for those of you who have not already done so to silence your cell phones. We appreciate that, thank you. And as always, we extend our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors whose generous financial support make these time-honored luncheons possible. I'd like to acknowledge Ed Harnden, managing partner of Baron Liebman, and his colleagues who are with us today. And please join me in thanking our quarter sponsors, the law firm of Baron Liebman and Zimmer Gunsel Frasca Architects. City Club's annual fund is in full swing. Donations to the annual fund play a very significant role in supporting the activities of City Club. To make a donation to the annual fund, you can use the envelope that's on your table and hand it to staff at the back of the room, or go to the City Club website at www.pdxcityclub.org. As you know, City Club has been engaged in a strategic planning process over the last year. And from this conversation has emerged a renewed commitment to help new members find their place in the club. One of the ways in which we hope to do this is to personally welcome those who are new to our Friday Forums, and so we're asking for some help. If you're a regular attendee of Friday Forums and enjoy meeting new people and would be willing to help reach out to those who are unfamiliar with City Club, we would love to have you join us each week in welcoming new faces to our organization. There is a sign-up sheet on the table back there where the brochures are, and we would ask that if you're interested, you please sign up and we will contact you. Thanks. Portland's population is expected to grow significantly in the coming years, and at next week's Friday Forum on November 6th, we will hear about the delicate balance between land use and quality of life in a discussion of Portland's urban growth boundary. And now on to today's program. Recently released by the Urban League of Portland, the State of Black Oregon report starkly exposes a persistent gap in living standards between Black and white Oregonians, one which is growing wider as a result of the economic downturn. Today's City Club welcomes three speakers who will address how systemic disadvantages reinforce social and economic inequalities between Black and white Oregonians, and will offer policy proposals designed to address these disparities. Our first speaker today is President and CEO of the Urban League of Portland, Marcus Mundy. Marcus serves the community through the Urban League's focus on education, employment, economic equality, and the advocacy needed to effect change in these critical areas. He is also a principal at a local healthcare compliance firm, Mundy Consulting, and previously served as Vice President and Regional Compliance Officer for Kaiser Permanente Northwest. A graduate of Howard University in Washington, D.C., he received his MBA from the University of Oregon. Our second speaker is Charles Hopson, the Deputy Superintendent of District-Wide Programs at Portland Public Schools. He oversees many district programs, including Schools Without Neighborhood Boundaries. Prior to this appointment, he was Portland's Area Director and Superintendent of High Schools, overseeing 4 large comprehensive high schools. Dr. Hopson was recruited to his administrative role in the district after 4 years as principal of Franklin High School. He also served as vice principal at both Jefferson and Cleveland High Schools. Today's third speaker is Karen Gibson, associate professor at Portland State University's Toulan School of Urban Studies and Planning, where among other topics she teaches courses on urban poverty and housing, as well as community and economic development. Her research interests include the comparative analysis of Black and white poverty and racial and gender inequality in the labor market. Karen received her PhD in city and regional planning from the University of California at Berkeley. Today's program will both begin and end with comments from the same person, so please help me welcome our first and fourth speaker of the day, Marcus Mundy. Marcus?
Thank you for coming out today, and thank you for letting me speak. Thank you, President Thomas, for inviting the Urban League to talk about our report. This is an amazing forum in which to share our findings and our thoughts around the Urban League of Portland's State of Black Oregon 2009. Before I begin, I'd like to have a couple of very quick thank yous. There are three people without whom this report wouldn't have happened: Midge Purcell of my staff, Katie Sawicki, who was half volunteer and half worker, and Kathy Humble, who was the editor who made the document that many of you have seen come to life. So I'd like to acknowledge them and appreciate them. And a couple of very quick thank yous to at least two of my board members are in the audience today: Laverne Bagley Brown, and Lorenzo Poe with Multnomah County. I wanted to thank them, and I think I saw a former state senator and a soon-to-be, a former state representative and a soon-to-be state representative, Bob Boyer and Lou Frederick. So thank you for coming out today. And last but not least, my daughter Nina is here because she's on her third teacher conference day in a row. So. The City Club of Portland, like the Urban League, has been in existence for almost 100 years. We're 64 locally, but we're almost 100 years old nationally, and we've both been serving the civic and common good. And I thank both the City Club for its service and the Urban League people, anybody who's been associated with the Urban League, for their service over virtually a century. But why am I here today? I'm here to highlight the findings in our report, The State of Black Oregon. This report was put out in our 64th year just to talk about what is going on in Oregon right now and what it's like to be an African American in Oregon right now. And I believe that the Urban League is uniquely positioned to speak and to advocate for the African American community, but for all of Oregon as well. I'm here also to perhaps let you spend a day in the life and to know that it can be sometimes exhausting to be a black person in Oregon. I'm here to shed some light on a crisis several decades long for black folks in Oregon, and that may now be slightly more understandable because there's a crisis for all folks in Oregon, economic and social as well. Each time I present information regarding our report, which chronicles key social and economic indicators in the areas of education, economics, environmental justice, employment, housing, health, child welfare, and civic engagement, I'm torn between making the case for change and enlisting the assistance of folks like you in the remediation of horrible injustice in many cases by inundating you with a litany of statistics that are simultaneously distressing, disappointing, dismaying, and in most cases, just simply unconscionable. Or I'm torn between that and appealing to your heartstrings and talking about encouraging you to work for the necessary changes and because it's the right thing to do. But I'm not torn. I have to share a few statistics with you. Median income of households headed by blacks in Oregon is less than 2/3 that of white households. And it's shown virtually no improvement since 1990. 38% of Oregon's African American children live in households with incomes below the poverty level. 60% live in households below 200% of the poverty level. Black children born in Oregon are 50% more likely to suffer from low birth weights and 50% more likely to have infant mortality. The dropout rate in Oregon high schools, which Dr. Hopson will speak to in his conversation, is twice as high for African American students, with dropout rates approaching 7% for black students and only 3% for white students. We're just 7% of Portland's population, but a disproportionate amount of our homicide victims, 45%, are African Americans. There's more and more, but I'm going to pause here because I believe we as a citizenry here in Oregon have become anesthetized to some of the realities that are right in front of our faces. We're upset, but we're not surprised. Everyone that I've shown this report to, they know bits and pieces of the story, and it can be distressing to them, but they're not surprised by the statistics. And therein lies the rub for me. We say that we're all even, all equal, but when you peel away the onion, there's little left but systemic, structural disadvantage. Uneducated, untrained Black Oregonians have felt the effects of globalization for almost 30 years now or more. You know, we were the first ones when we weren't trained and weren't skilled. When the jobs started going away, we felt it. That's why Oregonians, Black Oregonians, have had double-digit unemployment since the 70s, as well as many actually skilled and trained Black Oregonians. But certainly the unskilled and untrained have been dealing with this statistic that we're calling a crisis in the rest of the community now for over 30 years. And I wonder, why is it that we as progressive Portlanders and forward-thinking Oregonians and modern Americans, why is it that we accept as the norm the notion of an achievement gap or disparate life expectancies or substandard housing choices or economic divides? Instead of being outraged, instead of ascribing any sense of urgency to the actions we take on a day-to-day basis in our community, we accept it. It becomes part of the fabric of our community, and then we want to react with wonder and confusion when the disenfranchised group, communities of color, low-income folks, rural folks, when they bring up these sore subjects yet again, it's met with a sigh and not this again, haven't we solved that problem? Well, I can assure you, we haven't solved the problem, and it hasn't been addressed fully since the civil rights movement, since before that. I can guarantee you that as uncomfortable as these discussions might be, I will continue to initiate these discussions and these conversations until we, the collective, inclusive we, until we begin to work together to fix it. One of the questions that I wanted to ask the group, and what I frequently get asked, is why does it matter? Why should the majority population care about 7% of Black folks in Oregon and in Portland, and only 2% of the people statewide? And I have a few, what I think are interesting answers. I don't know. 7% is such a small number. And I ask you, what if 7% of your family was terminal? What if 7% of your employees were embezzling funds? Would that matter to you? Would you care? What if 7% of your roof had a hole in it? Would you worry about, well, 93% of my roof is covered? Would you? You'd care because you'd have to care, and you'd address it immediately, and you wouldn't wait. But 7% of Portlanders are in some of those very same conditions. 2% of Oregonians are in some of those very same conditions, and we don't act, we don't react, we don't move. There's no urgency. And that's some of the things that I would like you to ponder today. And as President Thomas mentioned, I'm going to circle back around with some closing thoughts about what you can do. But at this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Charles Hopson of the Portland Public School System, who's going to share some of his thoughts about our sections on education. So thank you.
Good evening. The state of the African American experience in Oregon's system of public education is fraught with the peril of systemic inequity, but it holds the potential for great promise. Being Black or of African descent is still a predictor that systemic failure because of race will be reflected in the highest or lowest categories in Oregon systems of public education. I want to be perfectly clear. Academic disparity between Black and white students is not related to a cognitive deficiency, as some in this country may lead you to believe. There is nothing different about the brains of Black students. Academic disparity in this country and this state in particular is a result of the failed attempts of integration and desegregation to establish the promise of access for educational opportunity and culturally relevant pedagogy for Black students. It is a civil rights violation of the worst kind in the city of Portland when, based on race and zip code, roughly 85% of white students have access to opportunity in rigorous college prep programs, curriculum, and resources compared to 27% of black students. We are a better state than this. We are a better city than this. However, we have a unique opportunity in this city, particularly within the next 90 days, to stand with our superintendent and board as they attempt to address the systemic structural inequities of our high schools. To be more specific, the inequity of educational opportunity between the high school experience of a student at Lincoln High School and a student at Jefferson High School. It is not okay for affluence, race, entitlement, and privilege to determine the opportunity or the quality of a student's educational opportunity in our city. I am not going to leave you with a list of strategies and approaches. Those are all discussed in the Urban League's state report, which is available from the Urban League office. I have only one deep, probing, and fundamental question to this audience as a male of African descent in this state. Does this city have the moral conscience and the political will to join our board and superintendent in attempting to provide the equity of opportunity for every high school student that many of your students enjoy by virtue of zip code, race, and privilege?
Nice to follow, Charles. Good afternoon. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today, to be invited by the Urban League and City Club. In the summer, in July, Jim Lee of the Oregon Employment Department wrote an article entitled, "Oh, the Humanity." He lamented that the mass layoffs which occurred last winter and spring were the worst thing he had ever seen. He wrote that with unemployment now at 12%, Oregon had not experienced comparable economic conditions since 1980. Yet the rate of black unemployment in Portland has been at 12% since 1980. A generation. Yes, there is a whole lot of suffering going on in our beautiful state, our beautiful city. Frankly, I find it ironic to be speaking here today about the employment situation of black Oregonians when the entire economy has crashed. Yet perhaps this peculiar moment presents a rare opportunity. Perhaps we can tap into our humanity, rise above our own situations, and develop a new understanding. A significant fraction of black Oregonians understand deeply what the Great Recession feels like because they have been marginalized from the labor market for years, generations. Well, you must acknowledge that many Oregonians of various backgrounds across the state have been living with unemployment and poverty for decades. We need empathy for one another, not necessarily sympathy, empathy, understanding, to walk a few miles in each other's moccasins. So I will briefly share some findings on employment patterns from the American Community Survey. It's 2005 through 7. This is in the Urban League report, which I encourage everybody to read. It's a wonderful document. Black males are doing worse in the labor market in terms of labor force participation, unemployment rates. They earn more than black females, but they are further behind their male counterparts in the state, and especially in the city of Portland. Many of my comments will be geared toward the city of Portland. This is what I've been studying for many years, and this is where 50% of the African American community lives, and it's where political institutions and will might be able to make some change. We've done some innovations before. Female unemployment has been 10.6% in the state, is 10.6%. In Portland, it's slightly lower. Male unemployment has been 15% since 1970. In the state and in Portland. But we know that the official unemployment rate does not capture the real level of employment distress because it doesn't count marginal, discouraged, or part-time workers who prefer full-time work. The underemployment rate is roughly 20% for females in the state of Oregon, slightly less in Portland. For males, it's 1 in 4 in both Portland and Oregon. Differences in median earnings for year-round full-time workers. Females earn 91% of all females at the state level, and only 79% in Portland. For Black males, they earn 85% of all males in the state, but only 65% in the city of Portland. To understand these racial disparities in earnings, I looked at differences in the occupational distribution and found that both Black male and female workers are much less likely to hold managerial and professional occupations, which are the highest paying occupations. They're much more likely to be crowded or segregated into service, sales, and office occupations. Males are less likely to be in construction and more likely to be in production and transport. Educational attainment at the college level. In the state of Oregon, both four-year and graduate degrees. Blacks have 19%, while 28% of all in Oregon have four-year or graduate degrees. In the city of Portland, it's 16% for Blacks and 38% for the rest of the city. Huge gaps at the college level. So generally, Black Oregonians who live outside of the city of Portland are better off than those in the city. This may be partly explained by patterns of migration. I suspect that many young Black Oregonians who are successful leave to go away to college and never return. And many newcomers go straight to suburban areas. Portland still contains 50% of the Black population, as I said, and many of those whose families endured the racial discrimination prevalent during the era of Jim Crow segregation in the decades following World War II. My study of the history of housing and urban policy in Albina from that period to the present lead me to attribute contemporary racial disparities in large part to the historical pattern of segregation, ghettoization, and disinvestment in the Albina district. In 1968, the City Club of Portland courageously published its own version of the Kerner Report to understand the causes of civil unrest in Albina. The main complaints of the rebellious youth concerned education, employment, housing, and police. The City Club's report on racial justice stated that the range and deficiencies of grievances in Portland is similar to that found by the Kerner Commission to exist in large cities in general. It includes discrimination or inadequacy in many areas, police attitudes and practices, unemployment, consumer treatment, education, recreation, welfare, health, housing, municipal services, and the underlying behavior and attitudes of the white community. To the extent that its problems differ from those of Watts, Newark, or Detroit, the differences are of degree, not of cause and effect or urgency. Today, the problems are just as urgent as the City Club implored in 1968. Inequality remains stark in the Rose City. Disinvestment in the Albina district over the last 60 years in the form of housing and mortgage discrimination, predatory lending, has extracted wealth from the Black population and left many impoverished. Without jobs, crack and prostitution filled the void, causing many of the Black middle class to flee Albina and the city during the 80s. In 1970, Black per capita income was 75% of white per capita income. In 2006, it was just 41%. The city's black homeownership rate is 37%, nearly 10 points below the national average. Without home equity wealth, it is more difficult to send kids to college or start a business. Race and class segregation persists in schools, sometimes in neighborhoods right next to each other. For example, King and elementary schools are roughly 1.5 miles apart. King is 65%, and 92% of students have low enough incomes to qualify for free or reduced lunch. Alameda is 82% white, and just 9% qualify for free and reduced price lunch. A similar pattern is found at Jefferson and Lincoln. Despite gentrification, many middle-income families in Albina are not sending their children to neighborhood schools. Poor students remain isolated in schools with fewer resources, and this will likely affect their labor market opportunities as adults. I must admit I have spent less time on solutions than I have been trying to understand the history of disinvestment and reinvestment in the Albina district. Complex social problems require careful study before policy recommendations are made. Often it is not the precise technical tools that are difficult. Power and fear are the more knotty problems. We need to focus on some of the human qualities necessary to achieve equality: love, empathy, courage, and persistence. But I will take this unusual opportunity to make 2 policy recommendations. Employment. We need to know how well our employment and training system is working. I urge the City Club to study Work Systems, Inc., our local conduit for federal training dollars, to see how well various constituencies are being served. Employers need to be surveyed to learn about their training needs and how the local educational institutions can partner in workforce development on both the demand and supply sides. Economic development. We desperately need to have more people completing college degree programs, associates, bachelors, and masters. Don't forget PhDs. Our state is not doing as well as it should on this account, and this affects our ability to grow our economy. A related issue is that today, higher education is getting less state money than prisons. What does this say about our priorities? Over the next 2 years, we are going to spend $1.4 billion incarcerating people. In my view, investing in people's human potential is the very essence of sustainability over generations. It is not rocket science. It is not sexy, but it is smart. We already have good plans. Success will require a long-term commitment to wealth building. City and county bureaucracies will have to break out of their comfort zones to reach out like they never have before. Transparency and accountability are key. Thank you.
Well, I hate following academics. They always have a depth of knowledge that I can't quite duplicate. The last part I wanted to talk about was just what can you do? That was a question that I asked myself, and that's a question I frequently get asked. What can people do? What you can do, you can start by reading the report. Read the essays, listen to the experts, but read the case studies, because those case studies tell you about real people that are affected in real ways by the disparities that you've heard Dr. Hopson and Dr. Gibson speak of. Read old City Club reports. Dr. Gibson alluded to one in 1968, but there's one going back to 1945 that talks about the black problem and these differences. There's one in 1992 that comes up with the same conclusions that some of our recommendations, some of our policy recommendations in the state of Black Oregon are talking about now. Training, the creation of jobs, having an educated workforce, having an educated populace. You know, the conclusions are the same because the problems are the same, because the problems haven't been sufficiently addressed throughout the continuum. And so that's one thing that you can help be part of doing. I want to close with a couple of quick stats. I was lucky enough to take a trip once where we visited Ireland, and they had a dropout rate of about 11%. And they were outraged. They were losing their minds because they had a dropout rate of 11%. Our dropout rate in the state of Oregon is abysmal, and it's twice as bad for blacks as it is for whites. And that's, you know, we have to generate a little bit more outrage than what we have right now. I mean, 7% of Portland has the worst health, the worst housing, the highest unemployment rate, the fewest businesses, lives in the worst environmental areas, has the worst child welfare and birth outcomes, and the silence is deafening. There's not enough reaction. You know what you can do? You can acknowledge that black babies' lives are as precious as white babies' lives and ensure that we solve the birth weight and mortality rate problem. You can rail against the fact that it makes no sense by any measure that blacks are 6 times more likely as whites to be incarcerated in our prison system. You can lobby to ensure that African American borrowers do not continue to be twice as likely, even now, to receive high-cost loans for their homes, which will help explain why we're only at 37% here in the city of Portland. You can be part of the generation that solves the Rubik's Cube of structural, systemic unemployment that has maintained double-digit numbers for all those decades that I spoke about earlier, since the 70s. What can you do? You can engage, you can participate, you can join, and you can care. You can engage in any number of the dialogues that we and others, but certainly we at the Urban League are hosting in the next several months. One as early as November 5th in Corvallis, and some following week thereafter, week thereafter, week thereafter. You can engage, you can participate in those deep dives with us, and not just with us, but with other CBOs, other community-based organizations. There's a role for everybody in this room and everybody in this city and everybody in this listening bandwidth to engage and to help solve the problem collectively. You can join as true partners, because if you join as true partners, it may be good for Black Oregon, it may be good for people that are constituents of the Urban League, but everything that's good for Black Oregon, trust me, it's good for all of Oregon. And you have to come from that context or we'll never make any traction on these issues. And you can care. I know the people in this room, if you're human, you will care. But, you know, I don't know if I should say that, but empathy and a nickel can't buy you a cup of coffee in one of our 10,000 coffee houses right here in Oregon. You know, you have to care by acting. You have to care by acknowledging that a mind is still a terrible thing to waste, and that if we work together, no mind in Oregon will be wasted. So thank you for your time and attention. And I got one more thing, sorry. I'd be remiss and I'll get in trouble if I don't mention that our dinner is coming up November 12th. And I urge all of you to come. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, and Senator Wyden is talking, and Dr. Pelton, the president of Willamette, is talking, and Dr. Drucker, one of the premier scientific medical research minds, is talking, and they're all talking about our state of Black Oregon and how that matches up with their work. And the last thing I will say is, anybody can have a copy of our report. It is on our website, www.ulpdx.org. It is free if you want to print it out. We do have copies for sale at the League, but the important thing is that you read it. I'm not trying to make money selling it to you. I want you to read it, understand it, and then you can help join us as we work on these issues together. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our City Club host. Our host today is City Club Governor Promise King. Promise is the executive director of the Oregon League of Minority Voters and has also written on race and politics as a columnist for the Portland Tribune. He's been a City Club member since 2008. Promise?
My job today is to ask questions and get out of here. I'm not going to do that. I want to express how special this hour is to me. Why is it special? Why is it significant for me? It's because I am your host. It's not always the tradition of this club to have someone as tall as I am as a host. But here we are. Here we are, I'm your host. The smoke-filled rooms are gone, and the dominant man at the door is gone. What we have is Sue Thomas, Reese Riley, John Brenham, Ted Kaye. We still have Ted Kaye, but Ted Kaye is among the club that is now bold, beautiful, and yes, colorful. A time comes when it comes in the life of an organization when the voice of justice and fairness long suppressed finds its entrance. City Club has found its voice, and justice has found its voice in this club. What we have are people who are willing to engage the difficult conversation around race. So what is special, what is important for me, is because as I look towards this audience, I see the future of this city. Now back to my question. I have pounded some of the parlors in this city as a columnist who wore many hats as a special policy advisor to politicians. And I've had a chance to look at these numbers for almost 2 decades. The numbers haven't changed. This question is the Urban League president. We have these numbers, like you said, 40 years ago. Do you think is a function of the leaders' indifference or our ability to resist personal responsibility? Is it a function of the leaders' indifference to tackle this issue, or is just squarely the inability of our communities to take the responsibilities?
Well, I'll try to address that. I think I put a lot of weight on the leaders who are leading our city. They have a grave and great responsibility to address the needs of all the citizens they represent, and not just lobbyists, not just deep pockets, but everybody in the city. But we also have a personal responsibility. I don't think it's the abdication of personal responsibility. We have a personal responsibility as citizens ourselves to help make the change that we want to see. But the leaders have to come out of the box. The leaders have to coalesce the community that put them in office, or coalesce the community that selected them, to help us achieve our goals.
Thank you.
We will now open the floor for questions. We will take questions from anyone who wishes to ask one today. And as such, if the line does get long, I must remind you that you need to ask your question in 30 seconds or less. Otherwise, you will see this, which means you need to add a question mark pretty soon. So, thank you.
Wade Fickler, City Club member. I'll address my question to Dr. Gibson because I believe she authored the line in the Urban League report that says that education is key to addressing all of the issues that are discussed in the report and have been discussed today. And what surprised me, though, was that I didn't see a mention in the report about early education as a means of closing the achievement gap, and I'm wondering if somebody would address that, please.
Excellent question. I think one of the key areas where we have to put more effort on the front end is making sure that we address emerging issues with students in our Head Start programs and in preschool, because obviously many of the deficiencies that students experience later at high school are the result of issues specific to various areas that were not addressed earlier. So you're right. While it was not addressed in any of our comments, it is a key component when you look at the recommendations in the Urban League's recommendations and strategies. Good question.
Edward Hershey, City Club member. Professor, you spoke about the legacy of racial discrimination in terms of assessing the causes of some of the inequities you described. How much do you attribute to present-day racism?
Thank you for the question. I think that that present-day racism is a very big contributor. I think that it is largely in the form of being embedded in institutions. For example, the redlining that we speak of, that happened historically, well, it really wasn't that long ago. Okay, and as we've witnessed with the racial disparity in mortgage lending across the nation, it's still going on. So I believe that it is embedded in institutions. I have been comparing the 1968 Racial Justice Report to 2008 outcomes, and I'm finding that police, education, employment, and housing are still problematic. Give me the opportunity to talk about the North-Northeast Economic Development Initiative going on right now. The plan to merge the city's convention center and interstate urban renewal districts. Well, the process hasn't changed. It's not an empowering process. We need to build community capacity. So despite good intentions of many, many individuals, racism is almost bigger than any one of us, and it takes a lot of work to counteract it, its forces.
Ginny Cornyn, City Club member. Last week at City Club we heard a proposal for changing the structure of higher education in Oregon to make it not only more economically responsible to the taxpayers and to the people who use the system, but also creative solutions to create better quality higher education and more pull to then create better high schools, better K through 12, et cetera. Is the Urban League or any of your thought processes, I've not seen the report, looking at collaborating in terms of finding partners to help create a better educational system for Oregon, which would then have the effect of creating a better educational system, for the Black students in the state as well?
Well, I can begin the answer, and Dr. Hopson might know some internal machinations at PPS, but the Urban League, in our entire existence, we've always worked relatively well with the school systems and the districts that we represented. So we have ongoing relationships with PPS. They're positive relationships. They're not as deep as they have been in the past, and we're working to remediate that, to get more involved with PPS with the development of some more effective strategies to deal with the students that are represented by some of the stats that we shared this afternoon. Also, whether we did that formally or informally, we must be included if it is our children that are being impacted by the changes they're talking about. What's happened in the past hasn't been particularly effective, so we have to look at it in different ways. And we believe at the Urban League, between our national policy group and the work we do locally, that we're in a pretty decent position to share our thoughts and to positively impact on those discussions.
As I referenced earlier, academic disparity in this city is not solely the responsibility of Portland Public Schools. It's the responsibility of all stakeholders. So that means business partners, partners like the Urban League. So it is a collective effort that we all must engage in to effectively reduce and eliminate academic disparity.
Good afternoon, Joyce DeMonin, City Club member, and thank you very much for the moving and thought-provoking presentation today. After decades of socioeconomic inequality, what can you tell us about the state of elder African Americans in Portland?
Well, as I believe you know, but not everybody does know, the Urban League of Portland has a senior services center, and so we stay very abreast of senior services and what's happening in that community. We provided culturally specific seniors care for over 30 years in this community. The state of senior Black Oregon mirrors that of regular Black Oregon. However, they have some unique problems. They are, like many of us in this room, they are on fixed incomes. They are less computer literate. They are less trained and they are living longer. So what they're having to deal with, for example, is they're having to live longer, go back to work in many cases, deal with healthcare issues at the same time, have their family move back in with them because of their financial situations, or move back in with their families, either one. And there are very few focused services for African American seniors specific to Oregon. Now, the county system here does a reasonably good job. Aging and Disability Services does a reasonably good job with protecting those citizens and providing services. But there's still more work to do.
Sorry. Thomas Lauderdale, past City Club member, but I haven't paid my dues this year. Two questions in relation to Portland Public Schools. I went to Harriet Tubman Middle School and then on to Grant High School. But I remember when I was in middle school, the testing that was done for kids, whether or not they would go into AP classes. I remember thinking at the time that I was sitting in Tubman Middle School as a 7th and 8th grader that the African American students weren't tested. So could you comment on, has there been, and I attribute that to sort of like kind of a weird guess who's coming to dinner liberalism on the part of white teachers who didn't think of themselves as racist, but actually sort of didn't even expect African American students to do well in the AP tests and therefore didn't send them off to be tested. So there's a question of, my question is, has that been addressed sort of by the district? And then the second question has to do with that history in the 70s where the African American students who tested really well were sent off to Wilson and Lincoln, but the opposite didn't happen. Can you comment on that?
Somewhat of a complex question. What I will first state is that there are two major obstacles that we have to look at. And the first I referenced earlier, which are the structural inequities, but we also have to address and combat pedagogical kinds of inequities. And yes, we are aware that the equity of access to advanced placement opportunities and other college prep kinds of opportunities in this city is one that we have to look at based on students, first of all, having the access and making sure that we do not have institutionalized barriers that prohibit students the opportunities to test for AP or other kinds of programs that exist in a school. I can't quite reference the situation that was mentioned relative to Tubman, but I do know that probably since that time, a lot of those barriers have been removed and prerequisites so that we are looking at engaging more of our students in those opportunities. But again, that's part of that ongoing issue we must address in providing that equity of access for all students. I think the question specific to students going to various high schools in the city based on their performance is one that we must address, in making sure that every high school is one that is in demand, and that a student would not feel a need to go to another high school because of programs or advanced enrichment opportunities that may not currently exist in their current school. So we have to make sure that we are not allowing those kinds of opportunities specific to programs that exist in various schools that don't exist in others to occur. And I think we have that opportunity coming forward in the next 90 days as we look at high school redesign.
Mike Litt, City Club member. Overcoming generational poverty is a difficult and complex task, but recently I read a very stirring book by Paul Tough called Whatever It Takes. It's the story of Jeffrey Canada, a New York City educator, and how he took a block in Harlem that had been plagued by generational poverty and turned it around. I wonder if any of you have read that book.
I have not read the book, but I'm familiar with Jeffrey Canada, and what you're speaking of is that Harlem Children's Zone that he created. And I've heard him speak before, and I know bits about that story. Now, one thing he did do, and what was effective in the Harlem Children's Zone, he did the entire continuum from virtually prenatal to postdoctoral. I mean, they had a continuum where they focused on education, both for the parents, for the children, every step along the way. And they had it was an accountability model as well, because if you didn't show up at school, or if your parents didn't show up to a learning class or a parenting class, there was accountability. That also didn't start off that way, but that also was a well-funded project, in that over time he got foundation support, government support, real-life support. So I think models like that can work. One thing I've noted about Oregon is that we have, even in our community, we have every element of a Harlem Children's Zone. We just don't have them all working together. We have some good K-8 models. We have some good high school models. We have some good preschool models, but there's no glue piecing it all together where it works in that kind of continuum. But that is an excellent model, and I'm hopeful that one day a model like that can work in Oregon.
I would like to add that, to solve intergenerational poverty requires not just the focus on individual, educational attainment, but Harlem has recently gentrified. And a lot of the wealth that is growing in Harlem is not going to the longtime residents. And so the Children's Zone is good, but there needs to be a comprehensive wealth-building strategy alongside of it that does not allow residents to be displaced, moved around like on a checkerboard, and others with wealth come in to usurp the urban amenities.
Hi, my name is Rayco Williams, and I work with Portland Public Schools. And as I was listening to our conversation, I can't help but think about the deeply held beliefs that are affirmed when we hear disparate data and information over and over again. When we turn on the TV, we go home to our communities that are very segregated, and we believe the mistruths that we've learned through our educational experiences that confirm what we believe to be true about African Americans. When I've worked with Portland State University and currently I'm working with Portland Public Schools, what I find is a reluctance to speak about issues relevant to race. So here we are having a conversation about race specifically to African Americans. But when we go back to our offices, it will be something we're reluctant to talk about. It's something we're reluctant to admit or to confront or to deal with. And when we think about historically some of our experiences, some of the programs that were specific, race-specific programs, Portland Public Schools recruited teachers specifically around race. Portland State University recruited students specifically around race. There were efforts to do that. We don't want to talk about that. We don't want to move in those directions. I think it's something we ignore, and yet the majority of our teachers who are teaching our kids don't reflect their experience. What are their deeply held beliefs? When they don't have meaningful personal relationships, they go home to communities that don't reflect the student populations that they're serving. And they've been taught in educational systems that don't reflect that as Charles Hopson addressed, that there is an inferiority, that there is an intellectual inferiority. I see it in the hiring, that when we evaluate candidates for hire, African American candidates are not evaluated in the same way. Largely white panelists might say, I don't see them as confident. I don't see them having the same attributes. And we know that. We know that that happens in many different industries. You've talked about housing and healthcare and education and what have you. And I just want to raise that not as a specific question, but what can we do to deal with those personal, deeply held beliefs and myths that we don't want to talk about, that people don't want to confront in these all-white offices, in places where programs of color are run by whites, are directed by whites, and so forth. Those are the things that we don't want to confront. I feel like when we leave this, I would ask that each of us be willing to own our own personal stuff and be able to have an honest conversation about race, and specifically to race. So.
I thank you. My response is going to be short because you essentially answered the question. We have to be willing to have courageous conversations about race, and we have to, in a sense, become comfortable with being uncomfortable relative to a lot of things that we push aside because we worry about it not fitting or disturbing someone. I think what Marcus said earlier, we need to become more uncomfortable in this country with many of the trends that we see happening. And I think, Reiko, you and others have to be leaders in pushing the comfort or discomfort level in discussing those issues so that they don't have the luxury of hiding or being marginalized, because for too long that has been a challenge not only in Portland Public Schools but school districts across this country. So you answered it. We have to have that courageous conversation specific to those inequities.
And I won't add much except to say that, I've been quoted in the past as saying that Oregon's a pretty good place if you're a salmon or a tree, but if you're a person of color, it's a really tough place to live. I still believe that, but I still have hope, or else I wouldn't be here. And, some of the things that she talked about and that Charles just talked about, again, I go back to my statement, we need to have a higher sense of outrage, a more urgent sense of urgency, and have those conversations more frequently.
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Chappie Grice. I'm a retired educator. And I want to commend the Portland schools for their initiative on the equity in the high schools, and I'd like to commend the Urban League for your report and thank the City Club for this forum. I subscribe to a couple notions. One, that no more prizes for predicting rain, only for building arcs. And secondly, that there is no substitute for the work that we need to do, but there is a substitute for talking about the work that we need to do. And with that in mind, I wonder if either of or any of the panelists can express what your expectations are, particularly for the leadership in the African American community, but for leadership across the entire spectrum to address this, the gaps and the disparities. What is your expectations, or what would you envision, what would you like to see happen next with regard to particularly the leadership in the African American community? because I have no doubt about the goodwill. I've experienced it with the Oregon Arts Commission and other bodies that I've served on, City Hall. Virtually nobody says no, but I'm asking, what would you like to see men and women who are in positions to do something, what would you like to see them do or encourage them to do, or how would you suggest that they go about it next? And I'll take my answer sitting down. I'm getting old. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grice. We have talked and talked and talked about the challenges specific to inequity in this country. It is time to get past the talk and take action. We, the leadership, not only in the African American community, but in all communities, there has to be a call to action. There has to be a sense of urgency. This must become a moral imperative in our leadership if we are going to see any real change come not only in this city, but in this state and country.
I'll make one quick add. I know we're getting near time, but something finite I'd like to see. A lot of people in this room have the capacity to influence jobs and training and education and teachers' standards and practices and culturally competent everything, healthcare, teaching, training. Now is the time to step up and do that. You've got to make available to everybody what is available to just a few right now. If you do that, I mean, we're saying the same things over and over, but if you do that, everybody will prosper. So.
We've run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for this week. Please join us next week for a discussion about Portland's urban growth boundary. And as we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's speakers, Marcus Mundy, Charles Hopson, and Karen Gibson. We're adjourned.